now that we've got, bindings, how do we interact with the world itself, right? How do I interact with NPCs and quest items and all those things? Well, certain things are going to be similar and certain things are going to be different. In order to realize that, we need to look at what's available. So let me open up ConsolePort. And in the targeting section... no, don't do that. These are actually by the game itself. And you'll notice that you have target nearest enemy, previous enemy. So those are the ones that are, your tab targets. It's like bumper targeting in Final Fantasy XIV. You got target scan enemy, which is your nearest target, which is kind of like confirmed targeting, but only if you're outside. And then you got target's nearest friend, which is NPCs or players that are friendly players that are near you. It's essentially tab targeting, but for NPCs or players. And so you might be thinking, well, that's kind of similar, isn't it? Well, yes and no. In Final Fantasy XIV, when you press X, which is what I call confirmed targeting, if you're in a town, it will try to go to the nearest NPC. If you're outside in the open world, it will try to go to the nearest monster, and if it doesn't have one, then the nearest NPC. There is no equivalent to that. And there are limitations in macros, where I was able to make it target the nearest monster, and I could make it target the nearest NPC, but not actually interact with it, because it doesn't let you bind, interact as a macro. Either one of those. And so that really interfered. So that gives you two choices when it comes to interacting with NPCs. You can, as I did here for this demonstration, put on target's nearest friend, and then put on interact with target. And so sure enough, even though it's also going to my pet, and when you get closer here you can see it's going to players as well, so it's not super accurate, I can indeed press X, and it's going to try to interact. It's going to fail because I'm too far, but it's going to try. It works pretty well when there aren't too many people around. But quest items don't always get noticed by this, and also if you're trying to loot enemies, they're not going to be considered friendlies, and dead enemies don't count as the targeting of enemy option that I showed from the tab targeting. You have to instead do target last target. So now you're introducing 3 ways of interacting just so you can press the interact with target button, and that's a little bit annoying. If you really want to go for that Final Fantasy XIV feel, you can try to do that, or you can, like I did, accept that this is a different game and take advantage of the thing that I've had on the screen this entire time, which is a centered cursor. And that's what I'm going to assume people will be using in this setup because it just works very nicely. So to do that, you go to Settings, you go to Mouse, and you use Always Show Mouse Cursor, and enable mouse handling, and then you'll have it always in the center. If you turn it off, it will still be usable, as in if you turn off Always Show, it will just be invisible during certain conditions, after a certain time, and if you turn on, disable when jumping or things like that, it will turn itself off. I don't think I have those conditions on, but it still is usable even when that happens. Personally though, I like having it on all the time because I like to see exactly where it is. I don't want to have to take guesses as to whether I'm interacting with an NPC or not, especially with quest items that are very, very small sometimes. It's just really nice to always have it on all the time. So you can turn this off, but I would recommend having both of these on, and make sure you have the custom mouse handling. If you want the jump feature for hiding upon a jump, it is right here. You can right here, then right here, then here, click continue, continue, so you can get this screen back. Okay, now let me take these things off because I'm not going to be using them. And let's get started with how I am going to be making this setup. So on the side, you can see I have a reference that I've created before, and it kind of has the overview of the various Final Fantasy XIV bindings. So right now it's showing for left or right modifier or both, because that's actually for the most part treated the same as far as non-actions in Final Fantasy XIV. So we need to start here. We got our hotbar edit. Well, we don't have one here, so never mind. Then we've got our tab target. Before we do anything, we go to settings again. And we're going to go to advanced and make sure allow binding overlap is on. This will allow us to create multiple bindings for the same action. Now we're going to go to targeting. There is a target scan. It goes literally to the nearest target. It's not a quote tab targeting instead of cycling through. So that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for this. Target nearest enemy. So we're going to make one for L2 plus R1. Now in this version, it won't list all of the ones that we have, but if we just click on it again, we can do it one more time. So R2 plus R1, and then L2 and R2 plus R1. Now I should, in theory, make the equivalent for L1, but since we're using L1 as a modifier, and you cannot do that kind of combination to a modifier in World of Warcraft, we're just not going to have it there. And that's fine. If I go here, I can see, by pressing, that all three versions have my tab targeting. So we're skipping this one. Actually, we're skipping that one. We're doing this one. We already did all of these. These are the actions. This does not have any specific thing. And this one, which is clicking in R3, is a duty action. Okay. Well, we're going to go to special. Extra action button is essentially our duty action. So we'll do one for R2 and R3, another one for L2 and R3, and another one for both of them together and R3. This is saying that if we click again, tap again, we end up on our double or possibly on our expanded. This is already taken care of as far as the expanded goes, and we're not doing double in this video. It will be in the next one. And then we don't have a map slow, so this is done for the time being. Let's go to R1. Well, we don't have R1 as a modifier here because we only have 3 modifiers, which is actually a good thing. So then we've got the L1 modifier, which in Final Fantasy XIV is your targeting and autorun. I actually don't like using that as the autorun. I turned that off and then I use Steam to create a different binding. But if you want to do it, you can. You can absolutely go to movement keys. I recommend toggle so you don't accidentally end up starting and locking yourself out. And you can do L1 and then press your left stick up, and now you've got that available. I don't like it, but you have it available. But I don't like it. I prefer doing this, R2 and options or start. I find that much better. So we've got our screenshot that is going to be a miscellaneous. Hide HUD, that's toggle user interface. We don't have map flat. Well, I mean, we do, but I'm not worrying about that. There is no idea of filter select, so we can skip these for the time being. And there is no concept of enmity targeting enemies that you already have aggro to. Is it possible you could make a macro? Maybe. I would have to think about that, but I don't have one available for this video. So for the time being, I keep going to markers. We're going to bind these yet again to target nearest enemy, and this time we can actually do previous. So L1 up, L1 down. And this is Alliance. You might be thinking, oh, I guess you're going to target nearest friend. No, that's awful. Going to go to Special and toggle our ray cursor. We do need a way to turn it off, and the thing about the ray cursor is that it uses the D-pad. So when we toggle it on, now we can't turn it back off because I'm using the D-pad for it. But I will be handling that later. And then we've got our virtual mouse toggle. That means is in the concept of World of Warcraft is when you press your virtual mouse toggle, now you can move your mouse around freely. This is part of the custom handling. There is a way to do it without using that by using the native support. It requires doing some messing around with the global variables, and I'm not going to be doing that. So that's one of the reasons why you may want to have custom handling. And if you are using that interact method and not the center method, this is essentially how you would be interacting with quest items. And that's why it gets really tedious. Really, really tedious. So, in this case, it is by using whatever you have mapped to the left mouse button. So we already have this. It's in a different location, right? Because in Final Fantasy XIV it's in the right, and here we have it on the left. Oh, and just for reference, I decided to stick to left and right stick as left mouse button and right mouse button. In case I didn't mention that before. That is what I decided eventually to stick with. So while this will be slightly different, it's still mostly the same. We're going to skip these tab targets. And we've already done the auto run. Then we've got zoom. Oh boy, zoom. So we're gonna go to camera. And you can actually do the zoom that Final Fantasy XIV has. You can do your zoom out, L1 and right stick up. And, well, actually that was zoom in, and this one is zoom out, right stick down. And if I go slowly, yeah. But if I do it quickly, because it still does the camera movement, it doesn't just do the zoom, and so it's quite inconvenient, to say the least. You can choose to leave it there, or we can take advantage that we don't have, these filters, and maybe map the camera to those instead. So what I'm going to recommend is, if you want to keep these, go ahead. I'm going to remove them so I don't have accidents. I'm going to put square as zoom in, circle as zoom out, and center camera as for triangle. Originally I wanted to do triangle was like in and then X was out, but that interferes with some of the ways I'm going to be doing a few other things, so kinda had to do it this way. Few changes, nothing too major. And then we get to no modifiers. we've got our main menu. Okay, interface panel, toggle main menu, easy peasy. Our HUD select, we don't have one. ConsolePort might actually be getting one, but instead I'm going to put the toggle rate cursor, so that way we can turn it off. And that actually makes sense. I'll show after. Actually, I can show now, yeah. Let me turn off my UI add-on. Now that I've reloaded, if I turn on the cursor, let's say I'm pretending it's an alliance member, now I can use up and down because they're up and down. If they were left and right of each other, it would actually be left and right. So it takes over the D-pad. If you can't see, I'm looking at my party list. You see those little circles? That's the rate cursor. And so if I want to turn it off, I just press the center button. The rate cursor is a special thing by ConsolePort. It works like a soft target, which means that you're not actually targeting the person. You can't set that in the settings, but rather it will send it to that person if it's a friendly spell, and then send it to your actual target, the enemy, if it's not. So it's actually really smart and a good way of using it. Next up, we've got the subcommand button, another command that does not actually exist in its entire concept in World of Warcraft, because in Final Fantasy XIV, if you have nothing targeted, it's used as a map. But there are certain circumstances, like if you have menus open or whatever, when it's used as a way of showing you a list of things to do, which is kind of like a right click. And so it's not really possible to make something that has both functionalities in one button and a macro, because of limitations to click macros. So we're just going to use it for its basic functionality of the map. Bindings, interface, world map pane. Next up, confirm. I think I mentioned before that one does not really exist in its exact state, so what we are settling for is interact with mouse over. It's technically not necessary because you can use whatever you have as your right mouse button to do everything that's going to do, but it's just going to feel better. Next up, cancel. So in World of Warcraft, the game menu is also the cancel button. So a simple thing would just be, hey, bind it again, right? I could. But do I want to? I decided no, I just want cancel to be cancel my target. I'll use the start button if I want to cancel other things like menus, and I figured that'd be fine. If you don't want that, just bind circle to toggle game menu and you essentially have the same thing as Final Fantasy XIV. But I would actually say, why is it doing that? To bind this to circle. If you remember in Bartender, for the first action bar, we actually limited it in the amount of buttons it shows, so it's not going to display here. But that's not an issue. You can actually drag spells and macros directly here for your bindings. So I've got this macro here called cancel. And it can be used to clear my target. Next up, jump. That's in movement. Easy peasy. Up and down is party list. So we're going to go back to that ray cursor. Up, down. And then we've got filter scroll. So in Final Fantasy XIV, filter is the thing that dynamically changes. If you're in a town, it becomes pretty much everything that exists. And if you're actively in battle, it automatically changes to just enemies. You can also make your own versions that you activate. If you want to say, well, I only want to target alliance members, and it's a left to right, or nearest to farthest, actually no, left to right only, targeting. That does not exist in here. So, depending on what you want, since we already have plenty of ways of doing enemy tab targeting, this would be a good time to maybe put in the target's nearest friend or previous friend, if you did want that, I suppose. Or you can just put enemy targeting yet again. I leave that one up to you. It really doesn't make a difference to me, because I'm not really going to use it at all. I've never been big into using filter scroll anyway. The few times I do use it, though, it's when I want to target people who are not in my party, but I want to heal them, which is really, really, really rare. So I guess I'll do nearest friend and previous friend, but I do know there are people out there who do use the D-pad a lot for targeting in Final Fantasy XIV, and so they would want to do nearest and farthest enemy instead, and that would be better for them. Personally, I've always been more in favor of using the bumper, you know, this right here, so that's why it makes more sense for me to use this. You could also put enemy player because we have nothing for that. Next up, assigned task. Ah yes, assigned task. So, in the other game, you can choose what that is, and I usually use macro because that way I can put other things inside of it. And so to do that, I'm going to go to the action bar. And if you're thinking, wait, didn't you put these as your mouse buttons? Yes, but that's fine. It will still do these, it just means that if I have some other combination where that's not mapped, it will still do its mouse button feature. And in our case, it will be when I have L1. So I will be mapping this, so that one's not going to be doing a mouse click. And I'm now binding it to here, so it's not going to do a mouse click. It doesn't show, but it won't. But I'm going to leave it alone for L1, so that's when I can use the mouse click. If there was a time where something really legitimately only works if I use the pure left mouse and right mouse button, which is very, very rare, especially for the right mouse, because for the most part, the X interact will be just fine. There are a few cases, once again very rare, where using left mouse button is required. The main one I can think of is when you're using a quest item that is a ground targeted AoE. For regular ground targeted AoEs that you use, ConsolePort has something built in to handle that, but there are a few quest items where unfortunately you're gonna have to click on this, and so in our case it'll be L1 and L3. And so that takes care of all the Final Fantasy XIV style bindings. But that doesn't mean we're done. We have some other bindings we might need that are going to be useful. And maybe I should go over what I'm going to put into L3 and R3. So in this case, it's meant for you to put whatever macro you want. What I like is focus target, where it will create a focus target if there isn't one, and if there is one, it will target my focus target. And normally R3 will be sprint, but there is no sprint in this game, so clear focus. What if I just want to remove my focus target? So that just works really nicely. We're nearly done, I promise, at least for this video. We've got a few more. First up, we are going to go and check our specials. You may have thought, wait a second, Squint, hold on. 8 buttons? 8 more buttons? 8 in the back? That's only 24 buttons. That's not nearly enough. And you know what? You're kind of right. Now I will have an equivalent of the double. Even if you choose not to actually do double tap, I will still have an equivalent for that. But if you really don't want to, if you're just happy enough with this, whatever actions you're not using in battle, you can just put into something called the utility ring. It will also add your quest items there. Or if it doesn't, you can add them there. And so for this one, I'm going to put it to the middle button, but only when you have your modifier on. So L2 and middle button, R2 and middle button. And so what this does is it has a list, so I've already added some actions I don't really need to have at all times. Or if I do, I just need to activate them once and then I don't have to for a while. And then, now I'm making a soulstone. I'm actually not really a big fan of utility rings, so I only added them for the purpose of having something to illustrate. I will be using my double for those things, or something to that effect instead. But that is what you can use if you want to. I do still recommend using it for quest items, just so you don't have to open your bag to be able to use a quest item all the time, and it is automatic. So that's why I do say you should have the utility ring on, even if you're going to try to not use it, if, like me, you just don't like having a utility ring. So, because I'm using unlimited navigation, it's pretty easy for me to access things if I just go to the game menu. But that isn't to say there aren't certain interfaces that happen enough that I really would like to have a binding, and since we can make so many more bindings to certain buttons, well, might as well. So over here in the interface panel, I'm going to put open all bags as my L2 and options. You might be expecting me to do R2 plus options, but I'm not, because that's where I put my autorun. If you are not using that for autorun, since it's not standard even for Final Fantasy XIV, then you can also repeat it here if you want. The other option worth mentioning is right here, target unit frames hold. So this is another way to target specifically your party members. Does it do raid members? I actually don't remember. Anyway, it's another way to target friendly units. So look over here, right? And you see an X showed up. So that means if I want to target, I just press X. And now I'm targeting that. If I had somebody else, it might be a square, and so I could choose one or the other. It's just an alternative if you don't feel like using the right cursor. And one last thing. Interface. Controls, yeah. Auto loot key. I recommend using Alt. The reason is because since I'm using X as my other interact for mouse over, which can work for looting, well, X is being used for actions when you're using Shift or Control because those are L2 and R2. But X is not being used for anything because I made it not be used for anything when you're using L1, which is Alt. So if you want to have auto loot, now this becomes the single loot key. Or if you're a person that just likes it always on single loot and then you choose to auto loot, either way, I say if you're going to be using this setup, use Alt as your auto loot. You can still have some extra buttons. If you look here, notice how R3 changes because it got the duty action, but L3 doesn't. It just becomes not bound, which actually means it becomes the default of left mouse button. So if you wanted to bind some extra things, specifically for L2 plus L3, R2 plus L3, don't touch L1 plus L3 because that's what you should be expecting to be used as your actual left mouse, since we did do an override of this that's not showing up here, but there is an override. Then you can do that. You're also probably noticing I did not bind anything to the PlayStation button or the share button. There are two reasons for that. Well, one, somebody watching this video could be using an Xbox controller and not have these extra two buttons. Two, somebody might be using the double tap, the actual double tap that I will be showing later, and that method is going to kind of make these two things. Specifically, this one will be impossible, and this one will be possible, but you'll have to pretend it's an actual keyboard input. So that's why I didn't want to use them as part of this video. Alright, so that's the end of this video. This is now a working setup, but do stick around for the next video to get even more buttons. Oh, and yeah, like and subscribe and leave comments, you know the drill. Bye bye.